Welcome everyone again this evening. Glad you could be with us as we continue our studies this evening in the book of Obadiah. We have a relatively short book, but an important lesson as it discusses God's teaching about the nation of Edom and the punishment that would come upon them. But the lessons for us have to do with the fact that we can be guilty of the very kinds of things that Edom was guilty of unless we understand the importance and are willing to obey what God tells us to do. So we'll talk about the first part of the chapter, as we already discussed. We talked about the punishment that God was going to bring upon the nation of Edom, but we'll see tonight then why. What had they done wrong that brought this about, and then we'll see in the end how God would exalt Judah. Now the first part of the book, in one chapter, we've discussed several ways God describes what's going to happen to the nation. So let's review that briefly. What are some things you see that he says will happen to the nation of Edom, the descendants of Esau? What will happen to them because of their sins? What's God saying is going to happen to them? Tell me one thing's going to happen. Terry.
Even though they take great pride in where they live and that they could not be destroyed, God says, I will pull you down.
Okay, so we described how that they were so proud in their security, living in the nations. They were convinced, or in the mountains rather, they were convinced that no one could defeat them. And yet God said he would. He could bring them down. What else do you see, Sharon?
He was going to make them small and despised among the nations.
All right, they would be small and despised among the nations, even though they were the descendants of Abraham through Isaac. Nevertheless, they were going to never really be a great nation, and in the end they would be despised. What else? Anything else? What do you see? Anything else it says that would happen to them in their punishment? Okay, we talked about the two things, but other things that we mentioned, other than the fact that they would be small and greatly despised. God would bring them down, but nothing would be left of them. The result would be they would be completely destroyed, unlike, for example, a thief who would leave something usually. God said when he was done with them, there would be nothing left. And he talks about how that they would be betrayed by their own confederates, by their own friends, would bring about their downfall. And those were things we covered last time through verse 7. Questions or comments anyone has before we move on? Let's read some more verses then. Let's read let's go with 8 through 14. Who would like to read verses 8 through 14 for us, please? Obadiah, verses 8 through 14. Bill, please.
Will I not in that day, says the Lord, even destroy the wise men from Edom and understanding from the mountains of Esau? Then your mighty men of tell men shall be dismayed, to the end that everyone from the mountains of Esau may be cut off by slaughter. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. Even you were as one of them, but you should not have gazed at on that day of your brother, in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced of the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor shall you have delivered up among them who remained in the day of distress.
Okay, so we have a couple more things he says in verses 8 and 9. about the problems that they would face and why they would face them. What does he say would happen to them according to verse 8? This is question number 17. What does he say was going to happen to them in the punishment that God would bring upon them? What was something that would happen to them? Verse 8. Bill.
And to destroy the wise men of Edom.
All right, the wise in understanding are going to be destroyed. And then in verse 9, he describes a consequence that would come from that. What would happen because, or related to that fact that the wise men were destroyed, what would happen to someone else according to verse 9? What else would happen? Bill?
They'll be cut off by slaughter.
All right. So the mighty men will be dismayed, and that everyone in the mountains of Esau will be cut off by slaughter. What connection do you see between those two? What's the connection between verse 8, that the wise in understanding will be destroyed, and then verse 9, the mighty men will be dismayed, and in the end the people will be cut off? What's the connection between those two verses? Anybody? Frank.
Well, if the wise, the understanding, the leaders of the nation were destroyed, then even the mighty men of their armies would be dismayed and confused and not know how to proceed, how to go on.
Okay, so every nation needs wise men to guide it, and of course we read often in the Bible of kings who had counselors and men who would advise them and so on. Sometimes they had wise, good counselors. Sometimes they had counselors that were not really reliable, but they all had advisors, men who counseled them and so on. So if the wise men were destroyed from Edom, then even the military leaders would not know what to do, would not know how to proceed, and the end result would be that the nation would be destroyed. So here's something that God was going to do to bring about this destruction that he promised, or prophesied, and that is that they would lose their wise leaders. Okay? Comments, discussion on those verses? What happens to a nation today if our leaders are not wise? Same problem, right? Is it not the same concern that if our leaders, if those who rule don't have wise men to guide them or don't listen to those who are wise, there's going to be problems in any nation. And the same thing is true with our nation, which is why it's so important for us to pray for our rulers that they have true wisdom and will listen to the wisdom from God. Anything else through verse 9? Rick?
Well, Edom was a very, very proud nation that had good military force and had always had their way, and they thought they was up in them mountains in a fortress-like situation to where they could never be brought down. And Obadiah is saying, your wise men's going to go first, and your mighty men's going to follow that. You will be destroyed.
So even no matter how a nation may think they are secure, if they don't have wise leadership, they can be brought down. Okay? All right, let's look further now at beginning of verse 10. At this point, it changes direction, and here it begins to describe the reasons why God was going to bring these problems upon Edom. We've had it discussed what the problems were going to be, the destruction and so on. Now it's going to begin to tell us why, and this is kind of the main point, I believe, of the letter, is the problems that Edom had that we need to learn from as well. So let's look at what he says beginning in verse 10. What did he say in verse 10 that they had done that was going to cause God to bring punishment upon them? Let's start with verse 10. What reason does he give in verse 10? Tim.
Violence against their brother.
Violence against your brother Jacob. Remember we talked about last time that Jacob and Esau were sons, twin sons really, of Isaac and Rebekah. And though Esau was the oldest, God had determined to give the blessing and the birthright to Jacob the younger. And There was problems between the two during their lifetime, but the problems continued even afterwards between the nations that came from them. And that's what he's talking about here. Violence against their brother. And he said, for this shame will cover you and you will be cut off forever. Now we'll notice some specifics as we go along. Comments on verse 10 before we move on. Let me look at several things and put it together. Sharon.
I think it's interesting that he reminds them that they're related. The Jews and the Edomites would have thought of themselves as separate nations and enemies, but God remembers that they all came from twin brothers. And still today, people really like to divide ourselves all up into groups based on anything, where we live, how we look, our preferences, anything. And then we decide that our group is better than every other group, and maybe we even have the right to mistreat the other groups. But God sees us as essentially the same. We're all his creatures. We're all related to one another, and we have no business mistreating one another. We need to treat each other like family.
Okay. And in particular, I believe it has to do with the promises that God made to Abraham, because these are all descendants of Abraham. And that when you read the history of the nation of Israel, even when they moved into the land of Canaan, God told them that the nations that were related to them through Abraham were to be treated differently from other nations. So God expected them to recognize the relationship that they had as descendants of Abraham. And because they weren't willing to do that, and they mistreated those who they ought to treat properly, they're going to be cut off. So let's look at verse 11. What else does verse 11 say they did? What else did they do? Verse 11.
They just stood and watched as foreigners entered the gates of Jerusalem and cast lots for it.
Okay.
They didn't do anything to help them.
Okay. So he says, foreigners entered the gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. And he says, you stood on the other side. That is, not on the side with Jerusalem and Judah, but on the other side. On the side of those who were carrying them captive. And so at the end of the verse, then he has the expression that I used as the heading here. He says, you were as one of them. Okay? You were as one of them. All right, comments? All right, let's look at some other verses, and then we'll maybe summarize. Let's see what else we've got here. Okay. So they stood on the other side, and they were as one of them, verse 11. How about verse 12? What does he say about it in verse 12? It's Terry.
They were gloating over what was happening.
Okay, he says
He wants them not to, but it was an indication that that's what they've been doing.
Okay, he says they rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. He said you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have spoken proudly in the day of their distress. You should not have gazed on your brother in his captivity. So the idea here appears to be that, okay, they were suffering, but rather than having a sense of compassion that this other nation was being punished or suffering by enemies, they were glad. They rejoiced in the downfall and the punishment and suffering of a nation that was related to them. All right? Let's see where we are here in our notes now. Okay. Right. They gazed on the captivity of the brother, rejoiced in their destruction. And then he says in verse 13, what else does he say? What else does he say in verse 13, Frank?
He said, you should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. And you should not have gazed on their affliction or gloated in their affliction in their time of calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. And, that gives me the idea, the understanding that they had gone into the city and taken their possessions as spoils, as if they were spoils of war.
Okay, so they took some of the spoils, apparently, from the city. I don't see where in the description that they were the ones, that Edom was the one who started the war, you might say. It's not like they initiated the conflict and started a war against Judah and Jerusalem, but when others began it, they cooperated. They were sympathetic towards the enemies, and then they took part in the loot, we would say, shared the booty with those who were causing the problems, and were glad for the downfall and the suffering of the people of Israel. Okay? And then one more, verse 14. Let me see if my chart's are right. Okay, what else? Verse 14. What else did they do? Sure.
They even helped the enemies and made sure that the Jews who were trying to escape couldn't.
Okay, so the people that were trying to escape from the battle, the people of Edom, would prevent them from escaping so that their enemies could capture them. All right, so here we see these things that they did. Okay, all right. So let's look back at this now. This pretty much summarizes, I think, the guilt that they committed, the things they did wrong. So, what do we learn from that? Ask a question number 22. What are some passages that talk about having fellowship with those who do wrong? And it seems to me that seems to be a critical point here. It wasn't necessarily that the Edomites would have initiated the wrong, but when somebody else did it, they were glad to join in, glad for the downfall of the people of Judah. So this is a concept that we sometimes call fellowship. That's not the word that's used here, but in the New Testament, it's called cooperating, going along with people who do what's wrong. So I ask you some passages then, question number 22. What are some passages that talk about the problem of participating in other people's wrong? Terry.
Romans 1:32, though they knew God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them.
All right, so through the chapter, first chapter of Romans, Paul has discussed that those who depart from the way of God, especially Gentiles in this case, fail to worship the true God and begin to practice all kinds of wickedness and immorality. But at the end, he says that those who do those things deserve to be punished. They deserve death, spiritual death, of course. And also those who approve of those who practice such things. That's what Edom was doing. They were maybe not personally doing all the wrong things the enemies were doing, but they were agreeing with it and approving of it, encouraging it. Okay? Other comments on that passage or other passages? Rick.
2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14 says that do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness?
Okay, and really if we continue down through the rest of that chapter, he says the same thing in a number of different ways. He says, what accord has Christ with Belial? What part has an unbeliever, a believer with an unbeliever? What agreement does the temple of God have with idols? And so he says, come out from among them, verse 17, and be separate. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you and be a father to you. So again, the problem is not just the wrongs that we do, but the way we may cooperate with or participate with other people who do wrong. If we want God to be our God and we want to be his people, we have to realize that we must not participate in the wrongs that other people do. Okay? Other comments on that passage or other passages about the fellowship? Frank, was your hand up?
In Proverbs 1, verses 10 through 19, Proverb writer said, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait to shed blood. Let us lurk secretly for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like shield, and whole like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all kinds of precious possessions. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in your lot among us. Let us all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird, but they lie in wait for their own blood. They lurk secretly for their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who is greedy for gain. It takes away the life of its owners.
Okay, so here's a very important passage. Notice especially in this context directed to young people, though it applies to any of us. But it's so easy when other people are doing wrong to want to join in the bandwagon, as we sometimes say, peer pressure and so on. People say, hey, come on, we're going to do this. You come on with us. And he says that cast your lot in among us and we'll all have one purse. In other words, we'll be in this together. Join us and participate in us in what we're going to do. But what they're going to do, of course, is wrong. Notice what it says. The solution to it is, verse 15, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path. Stay away from those kind of folks. When they're doing those kind of things, you belong somewhere else. Okay? Other comments on that passage or other passages on the problem of fellowship with error? Okay, so let's look then at some applications. Question number 23. What are some ways that we may be guilty? Here we see what the problems are that with Edom. They were as one of them. They gazed on the brother's suffering and they rejoiced in it. They took pride in the fact that they thought an enemy was suffering, and they took the substance and they hindered those who were trying to escape. You were as one of them. What are some examples today of ways that we might be guilty of the same kind of thing or similar kind of thing, violate the same principles? Examples today? Frank?
Well, when people mock and make fun of those that are in need, or using prejudice and mocking or denying help to those that are in need, or those that are righteous, making light of the righteous.
Okay, so many times people make fun of those who do what's right, don't they? Now, they may not take initiative to physically harm those people, but they make fun of them and ridicule. And they're glad when they see bad things happen to good people. Isn't that the way it sometimes happens in our society, that people rejoice, just like Edom did with the people of Judah, rejoice when bad things happen to good people, and they say bad things, but they wish bad things to come upon them. Okay, other examples. Sharon.
If someone has been unkind to us and then something bad happens to them, it's very easy to get satisfaction from that, and maybe even pat ourselves on the back because we weren't the ones that did anything to them and they still got what was coming to them. But God expects us to be loving toward everyone, and especially if something happened that was unjust, we are to defend them.
Okay, so that's a very easy problem to fall into, isn't it? That if somebody is mistreated, wrong is done to somebody else, but that person was somebody who did something wrong to us, we're glad something more bad happens to them. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong if justice is done to them. Sometimes that's what's good for them, is that they receive what they justly deserve. But if they've been mistreated and unjustly treated, which was apparently the case here, that's not something for us to be glad about. We should want everybody to receive what is proper and correct. We're to love even our enemies. Okay, saw some other hands on the Rick.
That makes me think of the Good Samaritan. The people that passed by the Samaritan that should have stopped and helped him But they either thought they was too good or he wasn't good enough for them to help. I don't know which one. But yet the one guy that didn't have nothing to do with the guy laying there was the one that stopped and helped him, as we should do to anyone we come by.
Okay, and so that's an example, isn't it, of loving your neighbor, but even loving your enemy. Jesus said, "But do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who despitefully use you." So even those who have mistreated us, we should do good. We should not participate in the harm that's being done to them. Bill, what's your hand up?
In Proverbs 17, verse 5, it says, "He who mocks the poor reproaches his maker. He who is glad of calamity will not go unpunished."
Okay, so there's the idea of mocking the poor, making fun of those who are suffering through no cause, no fault of their own, and many times people do or take advantage of them. Same problem as Edom. Participating in the harm of those who are unfortunate, rather than caring about them, as some of you have pointed out, rather than trying to help them, we use it as an opportunity for our own gain. That's exactly what Edom was doing, and that's the kind of thing that Christians ought not to do. We should care for those who are suffering. All right, can I see some other hands? All right, there's some other applications I think we can think about. Look at what's happening, even in our society today. People get upset, claim to be upset over something that they say was unjust, and it may have been unjust, but they use it as an opportunity to riot and loot and take other people's property. So rather than just like Edom, they may say, well, I wouldn't be unjust, I wouldn't mistreat anybody, but if somebody else starts the riot, they join right in, and they start to loot, they join in the wrongs that other people do. It's still wrong, even if you didn't start it. It's still wrong to participate in the wrongs that other people do. Okay? And again, it's based on greed and selfishness, exactly like the problem with Edom and so on, and some of the examples you brought up. Any other examples then of the importance of not fellowshipping in error? All right, and of course we can make many spiritual applications, can't we, in the church, when sometimes somebody else starts some doctrine or some practice which is not scriptural. We wouldn't have started it. We wouldn't have said, well, I'll bring in the piano, or I'll support this, be in favor of supporting some institution from the church treasury. We may not start it, but if other people start it, we join in. That's having fellowship in error. So many examples. We need to take care that we're not involved in something just because we didn't start it. Doesn't mean we have the right to participate. If it's wrong, and we need to avoid it. Okay? Okay. Let's read some more scriptures then. And we're going to look now at the what God is going to do for Israel, Judah, as a result of the things that are happening. So let's read 15 through 18. We'd like to read verse 15 through 18 for us, please. Verse 15 through 18. Neil, please.
For the day of the Lord upon all nations is near. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your reprisal shall return upon you, upon your own head. For as you drink on my holy mountain, so shall all the nations drink continually. Yes, you shall drink and swallow, and they shall be as though they have never been. But on Mount Zion there shall be a deliverance, and there shall be holiness. The house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. But the house of Esau shall be a stubble. They shall kindle them and devour them, and no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau. For the Lord has spoken.
Okay, thank you. So, having described now the sins that Edom did in participating in the downfall, and by the way, I might mention, I'm not sure when this happened. We've already discussed the fact we don't really even know for sure what Obadiah this was. who wrote this, so we don't know when it was written. So I don't know for sure when Edom did this. I suspect it was more than once, actually, as far as that goes. It was a continual conflict between the two. So I really can't give you a specific application as to when this happened, but apparently Obadiah knew, and of course the people of Edom would have known. And God is teaching, I believe, for us, for our application, it's a principle that we need to understand. Okay, so again now, having described the wrong that they did, he begins more about the consequence and then how he's going to care for his people. Okay, so what does verse 15 say about what was going to come upon the people of Edom? What does he say about it in verse 15? Right.
It says that what they had done, there will be reprisal made against them. There will be judgment made against them for all of the evils that they had done against Judah and the house of Jacob, the house of Joseph, and Edom will be punished for all those evil things, the treachery that they had committed against Judah.
Okay, there will be reprisal, repayment. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Now, God has the power and the right to do that. As the God, he's the one who brings justice. He's the one who properly brings vengeance. And he says the day of the Lord upon all the nations is near. Not just Edom, and we've seen this in other books in the minor prophets, and we'll see it in others before we conclude our study, that any nation, and this was the point of Amos, any nation that continues in evil and will not correct their evil, God's going to bring them down. It doesn't matter whether it's Israel and Judah or the nations around them, God was going to bring them down if they continued in evil. Now he's applying this specifically to Edom. The day of the Lord upon all the nations is near, and there's going to be reprisal. They can't escape because they said, we didn't start it. They can't escape because they were involved in it. They're going to be punished. Okay? Other comments on 15? How about 16? How does he describe what's coming to them according to what happened to them in verse 16? Terry.
He describes it as a drink, as taking a drink, as they drank from the nations around them continually. These nations are going to come and drink and swallow them up as though they had never been.
Okay, now this expression of causing someone to drink as involved in a punishment or a suffering is rather a common illustration. It seems to me in this case that it's, well, you tell me. Terry has explained it. So the Edom had drunk, he said, drank from the holy mountain, meaning, what's the holy mountain here? The holy mountain is? Okay, Jerusalem, the capital city of Judah, was built on the mountain, the holy mountain. They drank from it. They partook of the spoils from Jerusalem, and now the other nations are going to come and they're going to drink from Edom. That's what it seems to me like. So that they must come and drink and swallow from you. And now the result is that you're going to suffer, even as you caused others to suffer. That's the reprisal back of verse 15, if I understand it properly. Frank, a comment?
To me, that carries with it the idea that drinking and swallowing is the consuming.
Yes.
They'll be consumed.
Okay. You want to explain that a little bit more? I'm not sure that I'm not sure I was following what you said.
Well, because they took of the spoils of the mountain of his holy mountain in Jerusalem.
Okay.
They caused pain there, and took of the spoils that was consuming,
Okay.
causing calamity for the people of Judah.
Okay.
And then so these people of Edom will be consumed by their enemies.
Okay. So they had consumed Judah and the people of Judea and their goods and possessions, and so on. Now they would be consumed by their enemies. Okay. All right. Other comments through verse 16. All right. So now this is what's going to happen to Edom. Now here's the other side of it. The people who they've been causing to suffer, the people of Judah, and so on, whom they have been causing to suffer, Jerusalem, and so on. What's going to happen to them? Verse 17. What about the people of Zion, Jerusalem? What will happen to them? Verse 17. Bill.
There'll be deliverance on Mount Zion, and there shall be holiness. And the house of Jacob will possess all their possessions.
Okay. So, where you will be consumed, as to use Frank's word, you will suffer reprisal for what you did. Zion's going to be delivered. Okay. So again, I don't know exactly when this happened. It apparently had to do with after the nations had divided sometime, but there was going to be deliverance. So whether they were going to escape, maybe talking about the return from Babylonian captivity, I don't know. But in any case, Edom was going to be the ones to suffer in the end, whereas the people of God, the people of Judah, would be delivered. And then he says they will be holiness, meaning what? The people of God's people, Mount Zion, there will be holiness, meaning what? What does it mean to be holy? Velma.
And his people would be coming back to him.
Okay, so there would be a restoration, a return to becoming the God's accepted people, and they will possess their possessions. Meaning what? If the people of Zion possess their possessions, what does that mean? How does that relate to the discussion? They will possess their possessions in contrast to what? Terry.
That Edom had taken their possessions away from them, and God is going to restore all of that to them.
Okay, so there's going to be a restoration. Not just the people from captivity or whatever and being restored to holiness, but then God will also see to it that much of these possessions, many of this loot, the spoils that were taken from them, they will once again prosper. In other words, they're going to be restored to their relationship with God and to prosperity as a result. Okay? So verse 17, the people of Israel, of Zion, Judah, will be restored and will once again prosper. But now verse 18, what's going to happen to the people of Edom when Israel is restored, or Judah is restored? What will this happen? What will cause this to happen to the people of Edom then? Verse 18.
It says, the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and Joseph shall be a flame. And Edom is going to be the fuel for the fire, and it's the stubble. So the fire and the flame is going to devour Edom and completely do away with her, so she no longer exists.
Okay. When a fire burns up stubble, what's left? Yeah, not much. Not much, is it? Because stubble burns quickly and easily. Okay? So the stubble, that's Edom. That's the people, descendants of Esau. But the fire, the flame, that's the people that the Edomites caused to suffer. That's the ones that they took unfair advantage of. But now they're going to be blessed, and Edom is going to be destroyed. And the end result is that no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Frank.
I forget where I read it, but something about the Herod family was part of the family of Esau, the descendants of Esau, and then it wasn't many years after the passing away of the Herod. Am I saying that? The Herods during Jesus' time, when they passed away, then there were no more of the remnants of Esau.
Okay, in Jesus' time, Edom was known as Edomia. Okay, and so that they still existed, but how many Edomites do you hear of today? You hear of lots of people from various nationalities that have been nationalities for many, many years. Certainly Jews have been around for all these years, but you don't meet Edomites today, do you? God said they're going to cease to exist, and they have, exactly as God said. All right, thank you for your participation. Let's take up in verse 19 next time, and we'll continue, Lord willing, through the book of Obadiah and into the book of Jonah.